Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Right, let's jump right in, folks. Today, we're going deep on a topic that's, well, frankly, often misunderstood, the Black Power movement.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking beyond the typical civil rights narrative to explore all those complexities and, sometimes controversies.
Yeah.
And the big question, right?
Yeah.
Was Black Power just this radical offshoot, or is it more like a key turning point in the fight for Black liberation? We've got sources lined up that'll shed light on the deep historical roots, the cultural impact we still see today, and, why it's often been kind of overshadowed.
What's really interesting is how Black Power, it didn't just come out of nowhere.
Right.
It's a part of a much bigger picture, centuries long, of Black people fighting for their own destiny. You can call it Black nationalism.
Okay, so Black Americans striving for their own future, and then Black Power emerges as part of that.
Exactly. Think about it. Slave rebellions, the rise of Black institutions, all these threads are woven into Black nationalism, this deep-rooted drive for self-determination, that's present throughout Black history. Historians like John Bracey, August Meyer, and Elliot Rudwick, they've really emphasized this point. Black nationalism wasn't new in the 1960s.
Oh, so it had already been brewing for a long time.
Oh, yeah. Generations.
So Black Power is building on that foundation. It's
Yeah.
an important point.
It is. To understand Black Power, we have to connect it to those earlier movements.
Which brings us to those big names like Stokely, Carmichael, and, of course, the Black Panther founders, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton.
These guys, they were deeply influenced by their predecessors,
Right.
like Marcus Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, back in the 1920s.
Okay.
Garvey, he was all about Black pride, self-reliance, even advocating for a return to Africa. His ideas really resonated with Black communities. You can see their echoes in the Black Power movement decades later.
That's wild. I didn't realize how much they drew from earlier movements.
Think about the Panthers' call for community control and economic empowerment. Those ideas, they're directly echoing Garvey's vision of Black self-sufficiency.
Right.
Both movements challenged that idea that Black people had to depend on white institutions for progress.
So if Black Power has these deep roots and produced such prominent leaders, why hasn't it gotten the same attention as, say, the civil rights movement?
Historian Peniel Joseph, he addresses that. He argues that the political climate shifted big time in the 1970s.
Okay.
America was becoming more conservative, less receptive to movements that, challenged the status quo.
And Black Power, with its emphasis on Black pride and self-determination, definitely challenged that.
Absolutely. Plus, there's this perception of Black Power as the angry, divisive cousin of the civil rights movement. Images of armed Black Panthers, they clash with the nonviolent approach of, figures like MLK. This led to Black Power being marginalized in a lot of history books.
Almost like it got trapped in this narrow, negative portrayal.
You could say that. It's also worth noting that even researching the Black Power movement has been a challenge. Its decentralized structure, the lack of traditional record keeping, it made it difficult for historians to put together a complete picture.
So a movement operating outside those established power structures, which makes it hard to document.
Exactly. Now, despite facing these challenges, the Black Power movement, it did achieve some pretty significant things.
Okay.
And I think its impact on Black culture is where it really shines.
This is where it gets fascinating, I think. Those visible changes. The Afros, the African-inspired clothing, the rise in Black pride, especially among young people. These feel so powerful.
Those were absolutely a reflection of a deeper shift in consciousness.
Right.
Black Power reclaimed Black identity and heritage. Take, for instance, the push for Black studies programs in universities.
Yeah.
That was a direct result of Black Power, a demand to have Black history, Black literature, Black culture studied and celebrated in academia.
And these weren't just like add-on courses. They were entire departments.
Right.
And those changes weren't just limited to culture. The Black Panther Party, despite being demonized, ran impactful programs.
Right.
I was surprised how much our sources emphasized that.
The Panthers were often shown as just militants, but they also understood the needs of their communities. They stepped in where government services were lacking.
It seems like we need to break down those stereotypes. Give me some examples of these programs. How do they help?
Well, think about their free breakfast program for kids.
Right.
They recognized that lots of kids were going to school hungry, impacting their learning, so they provided meals, ensuring those children had a chance.
That's addressing a basic need, going beyond just talk.
Exactly. And it wasn't just breakfast. They set up free health clinics in underserved areas, offered medical care to those who couldn't afford it. And their educational initiatives, things like after-school programs and liberation schools, aimed to empower Black youth with knowledge, a sense of their own history.
It reminds us that there were many sides to the Black Power movement. Not just protests, but also improving lives in tangible ways.
Precisely. But it's also key to acknowledge that while the Black Power movement achieved all this good, it also had its share of controversy.
Right, we can't shy away from that. The militant image, the armed Black Panthers, the strong rhetoric, those aspects made some people uneasy.
And even within the Black community, there were diverse viewpoints. Like Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, he worried that Black Power's approach would alienate white allies crucial to the civil rights movement.
Concerns that a confrontational approach might hinder progress made through traditional activism.
Exactly. And even MLK, while acknowledging the need for Black pride and dignity, expressed worry about violence overshadowing progress made through nonviolence.
Interesting point. It shows there were internal tensions and debates, not a monolithic entity.
Absolutely. Understanding those nuances is key. Now, despite cultural impact and community programs, the movement ultimately faced decline.
What caused that? A turning point, or more of a gradual unraveling?
It was a combination of things. Financial struggles were a major factor. Many organizations struggled to secure funding.
Why was that? Policies that disadvantaged them? Or did donors shy away because of their image?
A bit of both. They were often seen as too radical, too militant for mainstream funders. And don't forget, it was a time of social and political upheaval, so lots of competition for resources.
So a challenging landscape made even tougher by Black Power's image.
Exactly. Plus, there was the government crackdown, the FBI's COINTELPRO program targeting Black Power leaders that had a devastating impact.
COINTELPRO. That went beyond surveillance. It actively tried to dismantle the organizations.
Yes, infiltrated chapters, sowed discord, even instigated violence to discredit the movement. By the 1970s, prominent leaders were imprisoned, exiled, even assassinated.
A deliberate effort to silence them.
Precisely. That combination of financial woes and government repression led to its decline.
So we've explored the roots of Black Power, its impact on Black culture and communities, and the forces behind its decline. But the big question remains, was it a success?
That's where things get really interesting. Historical perspectives come into play. Not a simple question with a straightforward answer. Different historians have different interpretations of Black Power's legacy, and it depends on your lens.
So it sounds like historians don't all agree about the legacy of Black Power.
Right, they don't.
Can you walk us through some of those perspectives?
Sure. Let's start with the revisionist civil rights historians. They say Black Power was a natural, even necessary progression of the civil rights movement.
So not a rejection of civil rights, but more like pushing it further beyond legal equality.
Yeah, exactly. They see it as like a response to the unfinished work of the civil rights movement, a way of tackling the deep-seated systemic inequalities that, remained even after legal victories.
Makes sense. Getting legal rights is a step, but there's still economic inequality, lack of representation, the psychological impact of, centuries of oppression.
Exactly. That's where Black Power's emphasis on Black empowerment, self-determination, community control, that's where it comes in. These historians see it as addressing those deeper issues.
Okay, that's the revisionist take. What about traditional civil rights historians? How do they view Black Power?
They're usually more critical. They often see Black Power as too divisive, maybe even harmful to the movement as a whole. They argue that the focus on militancy and separatism alienated potential white allies and kind of slowed down progress toward integration.
So they worry that Black Power's approach might have set back the cause of racial equality.
That's the main concern. They worry that the focus on Black Power overshadowed the nonviolent message of the civil rights movement, made it harder to find common ground and compromise.
Sounds like there's a debate about strategy for achieving racial justice.
Definitely. And it's important to understand both sides. Now let's switch gears a bit. There's another view to consider, the Marxist perspective.
Right, that's where it goes beyond just race, digs into the economic system,
Exactly. Marxist historians, they highlight Black Power's criticism of capitalism and economic inequality. They see groups like the Panthers as trying to unite Black and other marginalized communities against, well, the forces of capitalism.
Can you give me an example of how the Panthers challenged capitalist structures? Having a little trouble picturing that.
Sure, remember their free breakfast program? It wasn't just about feeding hungry kids, it was also a critique of a system that allowed kids to go hungry. Challenge that idea that people are solely responsible for their own well-being, arguing for a collective responsibility.
Wow. Never thought of it like that. That's insightful.
And important, Marxist historians see Black Power as part of this larger struggle against exploitation. They say even though it didn't lead to a socialist revolution here, it did raise important questions about race and class, the inequalities of capitalism.
Okay, so they've got the revisionist view, traditional civil rights, and the Marxist view. Any other major perspectives on Black Power to consider?
Yes, one more important lens. The Cold War perspective.
Yeah.
These historians, they see Black Power through the Cold War tensions. They argue that the FBI used fears of communism and national security threats to justify cracking down on Black Power leaders.
Right, COINTELPRO.
Exactly. Cold War historians say the FBI purposely connected Black Power with communism, made it seem like a threat to national security, which let them justify surveillance, infiltration, even violence.
So Black Power became a casualty of the Cold War. Its message got twisted to fit this narrative about communist threats.
That's the argument. They emphasize how the Cold War played a big role in suppressing the movement, using fear to justify government overreach.
So the question of Black Power's success or failure really depends on which historical lens you're using. Complex story, no easy answers.
Precisely. And that's what makes history so fascinating. It's not about finding one answer. It's about exploring different views, understanding the complexity, grappling with the nuances.
Well said. Now, even though the Black Power movement as a formal movement declined, its ideas didn't just disappear.
Absolutely not.
The focus on Black pride, community control, economic self-reliance, these themes still resonate with activists today.
They do.
It feels like those ideas are more relevant than ever, especially with the current struggles for racial justice we're seeing.
I agree. Think about Black Lives Matter, for example. It draws a lot from the legacy of Black Power, especially the idea that Black lives have inherent value, deserve protection and respect.
And it's not just protests and awareness. Black Lives Matter also emphasizes community organizing, mutual aid, empowering Black communities from within, all echoes of Black Power.
They are. And just like Black Power, Black Lives Matter faces criticism and pushback from those who feel threatened. It's a reminder that the struggle for racial justice continues, and the lessons of Black Power are still applicable.
It's also interesting to think about Black Power's influence on Black culture beyond activism. We talked about Afros and African-inspired clothing, but what about music, art, literature?
Black Power had a huge impact there. Think about the emergence of hip-hop in the 70s, born in those same urban communities at the heart of Black Power. Hip-hop gave voice to Black frustration, anger, aspirations. It embraced Black pride and self-expression that Black Power championed.
Great example. It wasn't just the music. It was about creating a space for Black voices, telling their stories, expressing their realities.
Exactly. And that same spirit was in Black art and literature of the time, a surge of creativity, reclaiming Black narratives. Writers like Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, James Baldwin, they explored themes of Black identity, racism, the search for liberation.
So Black Power wasn't just about changing laws. It was about changing how Black people saw themselves and the world. Reclaiming power, agency, self-definition.
Precisely. And that cultural shift still has a ripple effect today. It helped create a space for Black artists, writers, musicians, thinkers to thrive, to challenge those dominant narratives.
It's amazing how much has changed since the peak of the Black Power movement, but also how much work remains to achieve true racial justice.
I agree. Black Power might not have achieved all its goals, but it left a mark on American society. It still inspires those fighting for a more just and equitable world.
So if the Black Power movement accomplished so much, facing government surveillance, financial struggles, internal divisions, what does that tell us about the potential for change now? What can we learn from its wins and losses to guide our own efforts to build a more just and equitable society?
Those are the questions I want to leave you with. What parts of Black Power's strategy resonate with you? What can we learn from its successes? How can we avoid repeating its mistakes? Worth thinking about as we grapple with race, power, and social change in the 21st century.
Wow, some powerful food for thought. This deep dive has given us a lot to consider about Black power and its lasting impact.
It has. It's a story that deserves to be told, studied, and discussed because it's still relevant.
And we'll continue this discussion in part 3 of our deep dive. We'll go deeper into some specific examples of Black power's legacy and what it means for us today. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. As you know, we're in the middle of this deep dive into the Black Power movement, and we've covered a lot of ground from its historical roots to its cultural impact and even, well, its decline. But it's amazing how, even though the movement itself faded, those ideas are still alive.
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't just some fleeting moment in time. It was part of this, much larger struggle for Black liberation.
Right.
We talked about how its roots go way back, centuries, those early forms of Black resistance, the constant pursuit of self-determination. Those themes are still resonating.
It's like they planted seeds that are still growing decades later.
That's a great way to put it. Think about its impact on education, like the push for Black studies programs in universities. That came directly out of the Black Power movement, forced academia to recognize and grapple with Black history, literature, culture, in ways it hadn't before. And it wasn't just about adding, a couple new courses.
Yeah.
These were whole departments, hiring Black professors, fundamentally changing how knowledge was produced.
Exactly. Challenging that traditional Eurocentric curriculum, making space for Black scholarship.
And that shift in academia that rippled out through society.
Right.
It really legitimized Black knowledge and experiences, gave rise to this whole new generation of Black intellectuals who are still, shaping our understanding of the world.
Yeah. It's amazing to think about how much the educational landscape has changed. It's a real testament to the movement's lasting impact.
Speaking of legacies, we've also talked about how profoundly Black power changed Black culture. The embrace of Black pride and identity, the rise of hip-hop, it was this burst of creative energy still inspiring us today.
It was. Think about the visual imagery. The afros, the dashikis, the raised fists. These symbols weren't just fashion. They were about reclaiming Black beauty and power.
And they were powerful images, challenging that white aesthetic, redefining what it meant to be Black in America.
Exactly. And that shift went beyond visuals. It was in music, art, literature, all forms of Black expression.
You can see it in Emory Douglas's work. Those posters for the Black Panther Party captured the spirit of the movement. Or in Marvin Gaye's music, his album What's Going On reflected the social and political turmoil.
These artists and so many more, they use their platforms to lift up Black voices, celebrate Black culture, challenge injustice.
And that same spirit of artistic, cultural resistance, it's still going strong. Contemporary artists, musicians, writers, all carrying that torch into the 21st century.
Yeah, it's inspiring to see how Black power lives on in so many ways, from, college campuses to the streets to our music.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that the fight for Black liberation, well, it's not over, but Black power showed us that change is possible, that we can shape our own destiny. Our voices, they deserve to be heard.
They do. As we finish up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this. What parts of the movement speak to you? What can we learn from its wins and losses? How do we apply those lessons to the issues we face now?
Powerful questions. I think engaging with those questions is how we honor its legacy. It's not just about remembering. It's about using the past to guide us today, to create a more just future.
It is.
So thanks for joining us on this journey. And as always, keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.